So, what does bowling pins, beefsteaks, trees, and dirt all have in common? They all need rest. Bowling pins need rest. Otherwise, they will compact and become dead pins. You can actually wear out the life of a bowling pin by not letting it rest for a few months. If you ever own a bowling alley, make sure you rotate your pins. Beefsteaks need to rest after they're cooked. Maybe you know that, or else they're going to be very dry. Trees need to rest. In fact, scientists have discovered that trees actually rest their branches at night. And dirt needs to rest. Because if you overwork it, you will extract all of its nutrients. In fact, even the Bible recognizes this. And so if all of these things need rest, how much more do we? Now, it would be easy to talk about how work-obsessed our culture is. That Protestant work ethic has really run amok, hasn't it? It was once a word of liberation. This is not my children's sermon, I'm just jumping on. It was once a word of liberation that all work was holy, not just priestly work or clerical work or monastic work. All work was holy. But you know what? Capitalism sort of reared its head, the mercantile economy. Of course, we're Virginians, right? We know all about this. Back to the children's part. You know, kids, one of my favorite ironies about raising kids is when they are literally falling asleep in their chair and say, "I'm not sleepy." And as funny as I think this is, don't we do the exact same thing? Or at least something very much like it. Just a little less cute. Or a lot less cute. We drink that extra cup of coffee. We write that one more email. We binge watch Netflix. We keep doom scrolling on social media. No, I've gone from preaching to Bedlam. And with every one of those actions and the ones like it, we're kind of saying to ourselves, I'm not sleepy. Or at least, I'm sleepy, but whatever. Rest is holy. It's important. It's one of the ways that we actually acknowledge that God has given us abundance, not because God is going to give us more than we have. That God has given us a world and a life and existence that is meant to be lived inside. That is abundance, and that maybe we want too much from it, and therefore not enough. That was also not in my children's sermon. The 7 types of human rest. Did you know that there are 7 types of human rest? There's the physical, and that's obvious enough. Sleep, laying down, physical rest. Mental rest. Our brain consumes a lot of energy. That's why you need to eat a good breakfast in the morning, not just coffee. Emotional rest. Sometimes you need a break from heavy emotions, or maybe some time to feel some emotions you've been putting aside. Creative rest. The sermon you were about to hear is the product of creative rest, of writing, letting it sit for a while, and then coming back to it. Sensory rest. Sometimes you need to get the stimulation away for a minute. Social rest. Sometimes you need some solitude. Or maybe the company of others that's enjoyable. Sometimes that is giving and energy giving. That is a kind of rest too. And then there's spiritual rest. God says, a Sabbath for me. Have some time. Whatever your spiritual identity, whatever your spiritual beliefs, take some time to achieve or to acquire that sort of rest. Let's pray. God, we thank you for all the ways that you invite us to rest. And so let us rest in you so that we can rest with, from, and to the world. With, from, and to ourselves, with, from, and to our neighbors. In Jesus' name we ask. So if you've been in church long enough and you've heard enough sermons, then you probably know that it's often the case for preachers to end their sermons with a poem. Well, I'm going to flip the script today and read a poem to begin my sermon, just so we can perhaps set a tone. The poem is by Mary Oliver, one of my favorites, and it's from her volume known as Devotions. And I invite you to relax, unclench your jaw if you need to, maybe yawn, settle into your seat, and be conscious of your breath as I read this poem called Sleeping in the Forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the river bend. Nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts. And they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell, as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. I don't know about you, but that sends me every time. I can feel the cool night air, the tree canopy silhouetted around me, the stars above, the sounds of a nearby brook, the symphony of crickets, and there I am drifting into a blissful nothingness. It is a sweet picture of rest if I've ever heard one. And if you've already fallen asleep, that's okay. But it's only one kind of rest. And the morning that Oliver refers to at the end of the poem, I like to think, is the morning of the Sabbath. The great Jewish sage, a rabbi, once referred to the practice of the Sabbath as entering eternal time. But for me, growing up in fundamentalist Christianity, entering the Sabbath meant entering restrained time. It was restrained because Sunday, as a day of rest, meant not doing a lot of things that I liked to do. It was all about rules. Not doing this, not doing that, not going to the store, not playing cards. Fundamentals were really against playing cards. Not playing sports. I remember at my fundamentalist Christian college, they would place laminated cards on the ping pong tables, asking students and visitors not to play ping pong so that the Sabbath could be properly observed. It seemed to me that the Sabbath, which was Sunday and not Saturday, was more a day of keeping strange and sometimes arbitrary prohibitions. And so for me, the Sabbath was experienced as this kind of oppressive or constrictive phenomenon. But later in life, I learned more about my Christianity, as many seminary students do, from the Jewish tradition. I crossed paths with a rabbi, and I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about the time, biographically speaking, when I first read Abraham Joshua Heschel's book on the Sabbath. Abraham Joshua Heschel was arguably the greatest Jewish rabbi of the 20th century. And his groundbreaking book on the prophets led him to stand in solidarity with the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., contrary to what many of his fellow Jewish colleagues advised. Because not 20 years from the horrors of the Holocaust, when many Jews throughout the diaspora wanted to live quietly and peacefully, Abraham Joshua Heschel believed that he could not stand in the Judaism of the prophets, in his Judaism, without standing alongside his African-American brothers and sisters in the civil rights movement. Well, fun fact, Heschel also became a mentor to a young Cornel West, if you are familiar with West. If I'm not mistaken, you can still see a young Cornel West interviewing Heschel on YouTube. So Heschel writes on the Sabbath, and along with other discussions I was having in seminary, Heschel's classic finally helped me to connect rest and work and faith in ways that I hadn't seen before. It helped me situate the bottomless hunger of capitalism against the sanctity of the world and the human being as worthy. That human beings are worthy of enjoying the fruits of our hands. As it turns out, Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest in which to do nothing or not do certain things, like play cards. Instead, Sabbath was so much more. And so I'm going to refer back to our scriptures as we have occasion, but I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. I'm going to deliver a 3-point sermon. Now, some of you laugh because if you're like me and you've listened to a lot of 3-point sermons, I've listened to a lot of bad 3-point sermons. But I'll try to buck the trend there. Oh, and my 3 points are alliterated. So bonus points for me. So I want to talk about Sabbath in 3 ways, and I'll just tell you all of them right now. Sabbath as emancipation. Sabbath as enjoyment. And Sabbath as eternal time. Sabbath emancipation or liberation, that is freedom from oppression as well as freedom from work. The two are not the same. Sabbath as enjoyment, Sabbath as enjoying the work of our hands. Then Sabbath as eternal time, that is combining the two, emancipation and enjoyment, to understand the life of the world to come. So let's start with liberation. Theologian Walter Brueggemann, in his book Sabbath as Resistance, as well as in many of his other works, writes about Deuteronomy and the story of the Exodus in the book of Exodus as a path toward resistance against the economies of Egypt. In fact, in his book on the Sabbath, he writes a chapter on our Deuteronomy passage called Resistance to Coercion. And in that chapter, he recounts the situation of the second generation of wilderness wanderers, the generation after the Exodus generation. And many of these people were children at the time of the Exodus, that is, if they were even there to begin with. And so over and over again in Deuteronomy, Moses, the great liberator, the one who led them out of slavery in Egypt, he recounts the law, the Torah of God, and keeps saying, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt.
Even to those who never stepped foot in Egypt, who were born during the wilderness wanderings, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And one of the most important ways that they remembering is not just calling to mind in the Hebrew tradition, but actually acting in a certain way because of what has happened. It says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and one of the ways they remember this is by observing the Sabbath. And that's because the institution of the Sabbath was in direct response to the experience of slavery in Egypt. And it was entirely unique in the ancient world. The Jews were even called lazy and idle, even misanthropic, because they refused to work on their Sabbath. But you see, the thing was, they understood that their dignity as humans, made in the image of God, that their creative imitation of the Creator God, that it was sanctified and made holy by the right to rest and take satisfaction in that work. That it was a God-given authority to resist coercion and slavery and manipulation. These slaves don't rest but enough to be kept working. And that also reminds me of how free we happen to be today. I'm not going to make any false equivalent between slavery and what we experience today, but I do want to ask the question. If work is all there is and we're just resting to work, how free are we? You know, there's a long history of worker rights that is bound up with the right to rest. There's a song by Woody Guthrie about the Ludlow massacre in Colorado in 1914. That was a labor strike in which coal miners and their families were completely monopolized by the company that they worked for, a company owned by J.D. Rockefeller. You see, the monopoly included the land, the mine, the houses they lived in, and the company store, which oftentimes was the only store in their area. Sometimes they were paid not only low wages, but paid in scrip to the company store. In fact, just by saying company store might remind you about a song about a similar situation in Oklahoma. This is not a Woody Guthrie song, that's another song, but 16 tons? Anybody remember this? Even I remember this. Like, I don't even know how I came across it, but 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel and I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal. And the straw boss said, well, bless my soul. You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. Imagine working 12, 14-hour days in the coal mines, which was itself a hazardous place to work. More than 14,000 people died over 2 decades in Colorado in that time. You do all this work, and then you get paid, and you find out you just got more into debt. And so the miners in Ludlow, Colorado, decided to unionize. They moved out of the company houses into a tent city, and then there began standoffs. J.D. Rockefeller had hired goons. Those goons eventually partnered up with the National Guard. And eventually, as there was violence on both sides, but we know what both sides were fighting for, the tent cities were kerosened and lit, and women and children died. And if you'd like to hear the whole story, I invite you to listen to Woody Guthrie's song. And there's also a special on Colorado PBS that you can find on YouTube. Why do I share this story? Because history is bound up with the right and the dignity of rest. That it is contested, it is not given. So to observe the Sabbath, or a Sabbath, I'm not going to say that you have to clock out every sunset on Friday. To observe the Sabbath was itself an observation of resistance, reminding us that we are created in God's image, and we deserve to live as God lives. Like Tricia Hersey, the self-appointed bishop of the NAP ministry, she says, rest is resistance to the master's business ethic. Sabbath is emancipation. Sabbath is also enjoyment. It's my second point. We weren't just meant to work and rest. There is more to this routine than the simple binary of activity and nothing. From the book of Genesis to the Gospels, we are shown that Sabbath was made to enjoy the work of our hands, to enjoy the fruits of our labors. In Genesis 2, we read, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude, and the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that was done. And so God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, sanctified it, because on it God rested from all the work that was done in creation." Now, throughout history, the tradition in both Jewish and Christian contexts understood that this blessing and hallowing was the right to enjoy, that it supported the right to enjoy the creative work that we had done. That we as co-creators, as we as made in the image of God, in our creating, have the right to stop and enjoy. And this is so important because the tradition also has a history of fighting against the enjoyment of that blessing. Like in our passage in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus picks the grain for immediate consumption. He heals others and is angered by the Pharisees who put ritual above people's well-being. It's like they're missing the point. The Sabbath is for us, not we for it. And some people make the mistake of thinking that this is something endemic to Judaism. Let me just dispel that now. This is a dynamic that is evident in all religions, in non-religions, that we have a way of crystallizing ritual and putting that above people. Have you ever sat down for the national anthem? It's a good example. And we all have a tendency of doing that, of reducing faithfulness to these symbols. But in the Christian imagination, sometimes we have too much cross and not enough resurrection. That is, there's too much work, too much sacrifice, too much labor, too much hardship, and not enough reminders of what it's all for. Not enough space made for gratitude. Space made for open reflection. Space made simply to be. We could use more reminders that our creative work is for the life of the world, for our neighbors, our enemies, and everyone in between. And that the perfection of that life might actually be found in the life of the world to come. And that brings us to Sabbath as eternal time, my third point. Sabbath as eternal time. In Heschel's book on the Sabbath, he tells this story, which I love. He relates an ancient legend told by another rabbi that relates that at the time when God was giving the Torah, the law, to Israel, God said to them, "My children, if you accept the Torah and observe my commandments, I I will give you for all eternity the most precious thing that I have in my possession. And what, asked Israel, is that precious thing that you will give to us if we obey Torah? And God answered, the world to come. And Israel replied, show us in this world an example of the world to come. And God said, the Sabbath is an example of the world to come. The Sabbath is supposed to be a picture on earth of the life of the world to come, not inherently, we must make it so. That is what observing the Sabbath is about. It's like the combination of the first 2 points that I mentioned that becomes something different than each of them can be on their own. It's liberation from both oppression, that is bad work, and freedom from the 6 days of hopefully good work. But it's also the enjoyment of that good work, the enjoyment of its fruits, and together those realities create a small glimpse of God's dream for the world, of God's gift to the world that God wishes to bring about. Sabbath, to put it differently, is a liberated noun, a way to be present, even for just a day, to eternal timelessness, to the realm of God, as though what would be true of God's world is right now. And if we give that up, what is the struggle for anyone? But we have to learn to live in God's abundance. We have to trust that 6 days is enough. I know I could have made this sermon about a browbeating about how work-obsessed our culture is. I didn't want to do that. You already know. I already know. But the lesson that I continue to have to learn, to fight against my own work martyrism, which I inherited both from my father and from my parents' fundamentalism. You know, you're not working hard enough unless you're suffering. That thing. All of these theories, these lofty aspirations, they mean nothing unless the rubber of them hits the road in actual practice. 6 days is enough. May we believe that. Sabbath is so much more than keeping rules. May we live into that. And the Sabbath is a gift that is worth fighting for, struggling for, working for, if we choose to believe it. I started my sermon with a poem, and so I guess I'll end it with one too. This one from another poet that I enjoy, Wendell Berry. It's a piece of How Long Does It Take to Make the Woods? Why must the gate be narrow? Because you cannot pass beyond it burdened. To come into the woods, you must leave behind the 6 days' world. All of it. All of its plans and hopes. You must come without weapon or tool, alone, expecting nothing, remembering nothing. Into the ease of sight, the brotherhood of I and you. And hear this benediction. Dear friends, we have been nourished and renewed on this Sabbath day with the love of God who created us, God who redeemed us, and God who sustains us. So now let us go in peace, sharing the good news of rest, of liberation, of food for the hungry, and life for all the world, even till the world to come.